Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session. I'm joined by three wonderful panelists who were kind enough to come in from all over the country to join us here. And I'm just going to briefly introduce them by kind of name and title, and then let them introduce themselves a little bit more in their organizations as we go through the discussion. But to my left here is Cheryl Sadro, who's the CFO of UC Davis Medical Center, or Medical?
Health.
UC Davis Health, yes. That's right. And then Adam Harpool, who's a principal with the Health and Life Sciences and Digital Practices at Oliver Wyman. And on the end, Andy Bressler, who's a Managing Director of Global Research at BofA Securities. So we have a good, varied set of perspectives here for the discussion about academic medical centers, the future of academic medical centers, the economic realities that we're dealing with in the academic medical center environment, and how organizations can think about innovation as an opportunity to survive and maybe even thrive in the future. So just a couple of quick framing points. I know that everybody in this group comes from a little bit of a different angle as it relates to research innovation and the scientific collaboration between life sciences and academic medical centers. So you may be familiar with some of this, or some of this may be new. I think it's in most communities pretty well known that academic medical centers add value in a variety of different ways. And part of that is because of the complex economic system by which we fund healthcare in this country. Right? We largely, on government payers, Medicare, Medicaid, don't really cover the cost of care. Commercial health insurance pays a little bit more to help cover that. But then academic medical centers also subsidize research and education. And the average academic medical center spends about 1% to 2% of its revenue annually subsidizing research, so above and beyond what grants cover in their indirect funds and what sponsored research covers. Another 1% to 2% covering education, beyond what the government reimburses for graduate medical education. And then, of course, there are other community health and other missions. And so there's a kind of complex, and I would say maybe balanced but imbalanced ecosystem of how the money flows between the government, health plans, health systems, including academic health systems, and then back into research and education. And so as a result, most academic medical centers provide a lot of economic growth to their communities beyond just the healthcare delivered. So just a stat for Mass General Brigham, in addition to being the largest employer in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, an economic impact analysis, which actually there will be copies of for those who want it on the table in the back when you walk out, that we recently did, showed that the research and education parts of what MGB does in Massachusetts add about $10 billion of economic value to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts annually. And I imagine the numbers would be same for UC Davis or for others. And so the reason I give this as grounding is not to laud AMCs for what they do, but more just to say that the economic challenges that we're going to talk about on this panel have implications beyond just the individual institutions. And all of this in the context when in 2022, 76% of hospitals had their worst financial performance in recorded history. Not their worst in a decade, not their worst in 2 decades, their worst since they kept books in 2022, 76%. And 2023 is looking to be the second worst year ever financially for hospital systems, just behind 2022, driven by a bunch of factors, especially the inflationary environment and the hangover from the pandemic. So with that, we're done with the doom and gloom. And we're going to talk mostly about positive things and how organizations can use innovation to survive in this climate and opportunities for the future. So maybe I'll turn to each of you from your perspectives, and maybe Cheryl, you can start just sharing how you're thinking about these financial challenges at UC Davis and what levers you can pull from an innovation angle to help change the future.
Thank you, and good morning. I guess it's morning, and welcome to the site. So yes, so UC Davis is a little bit in that not 76%. We actually had a pretty good year this year, and that's for a couple of different reasons. We are the only academic Trauma 1 center in our region. So we earn funds from trauma, we earn them from 340B and transplant. So we've had a pretty decent year, which is, we're very fortunate. In terms of innovations and how we're going to turn that tide, we're investing a tremendous amount of dollars in just that. So we have started, for us, the year of AI. It's going to be a decade of AI, I think, because you can't roll that all out at once. But we are setting up many different things. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about digital therapeutics a little bit later, possibly. But we are really looking at, we've hired a chief innovation officer. That individual's responsibility is really to take those things that we do in research and get them out into the world, really. We've not had that facet before, and we do believe that that's the future of additional revenue services. As Niyum just said, we're feeling a really big crunch while the commercial payers have always wanted to, not wanted to, but have been that gap between what we earn on the governmental payers and what we actually send out or expend. They now are not really as willing to do that. We're seeing very limited rates, won't quote any of those right now, but we're seeing very limited rates in terms of increases, but our expenditure base is not decreasing. Our expenditure base is staying very high as well, particularly in states where there is unionized labor. So we're having to look for different ways to innovate, and I'll talk about a few of those in a little while, but it's about being creative. It's about looking outside the box and not doing things that you've done forever.
Adam, I'd be interested in your thoughts. You work with a variety of different health systems, including academic medical centers. What are you seeing out there in ways that people are kind of trying to play offense with innovation?
Sure, and it's a fascinating question. Good morning, everyone. Thinking about this time that we're in right now, I think about that old adage that you never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that's certainly true now, not to be cavalier, because I know our CFO friends are dealing with a lot in this economic environment, but what I'm seeing is not just the rise of these new digital technologies that can be applied in very multifaceted, very powerful use cases, but also a bit more wisdom and maturity around how technology is actually being deployed. We're moving away from this era of free money, this notion that digital technology is just like this magic pixie dust that you can sprinkle on fundamentally broken processes and, voila, everything will be just copacetic. We're now seeing a much more rigorous, data-driven, informed, to a certain degree, skeptical in a good way, deployment of these technologies. I'm certainly seeing chief information officers that I work with demand much more rigorous proof points, POCs, stage gatings, and things that I think we'll explore a little bit later around investments. And I think it's a good thing. It shows that we're sort of maturing after, the decade of meaningful use and the proliferation of EHRs. We're starting to treat technology inside of the healthcare context in the meticulous way and the reality-grounded way that a lot of other industries have treated it. I think Cheryl's spot on. It is going to be a decade plus. I almost draw an analogy to where we were in the early 1990s with the rise of the World Wide Web. And it's important, if you think back to that period, none of us knew what was going to happen. If you remember the predictions about the paperless office, now we use more paper than ever, right? So, the prognostication, which we as management consultants tend to do, have to be careful there. But I think that we're going to see some amazing strides in the coming years, and looking forward to discussing some of those.
So when you talked a little bit about this rigor, right, in terms of how people are approaching it, and actually, Cheryl, I'd be interested in your thoughts kind of on the ground. How you guys are feeling that, because you mentioned you're investing a tremendous amount. Mm-hmm. How do you think about measuring whether you're having financial impact or not, or but also not being penny-wise, pound-foolish and cutting off innovation at the knees?
Sure. So our CEO is very innovative, incredibly innovative, and actually sees AI, digital components being the way of the future. Not that it's going to replace a physician, but it certainly will actually complement what they do. So as we were talking about this earlier, I used the analogy, and this is a broad use, so pardon me if it's too broad, but private equity. So how do we actually want to look at digital innovation? Well, we can't really go out to the private equity arena, but we're going to approach it in that way. So as we are doing budgets and deciding what we want the future to be, there's a min and a max. There's certainly those bowling lanes. We don't want to go in the gutter. But we are actually setting aside a certain amount of funding for AI, and we're measuring the projects as they come forward in terms of ROI. That's tough sometimes in AI, right? Or any kind of technology. But we're going to measure the projects and see what we can do to maintain that investment balance. We'll cut some things off as they progress if we don't see them returning what we want. And for us, return on investment may be equity. I'll talk a little bit later about a process that we've been through that is really meant to bring equity to different populations with AI. But we will evaluate those as we go through. Assumptions, if anybody in here is in finance, assumptions around how we determine that will be very different than they would be if we're going to build a building or if we're going to develop a new service line. But we're going to approach it with, here's a pool we're willing to invest. We won't go to Vegas and lose everything, but we'll have a pool and we'll decide what projects get opportunities at that pool, and then we'll monitor them as they go forward.
That's great. Thank you. Andy, from what you see on the regulatory side, I know there are some headwinds that we're facing. We're all aware of those. Continued compression of government reimbursement, the threats to 340B. Do you see any tailwinds from the regulatory standpoint for what we're collectively trying to do to kind of integrate across the ecosystem better, drive innovation, or other headwinds that are maybe more nuanced that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, so a couple things. I mean, one is kind of good news, bad news from DC's perspective and the regulatory perspective is that Washington's trying to catch up a lot with the innovation side of things on how to regulate AI, machine learning. Those are things that are obviously very new that everybody's trying to catch up to, but there are several different issues on how do you regulate it, how do the different agencies work together, how does the FDA going to look to approve these new products and things like that. So there's a lot of activity right now in Washington. There's been some recent efforts on interagency task forces, some white papers on how the FDA can kind of work through all these issues. So sort of the good news is there's a lot of active thinking right now about how to address sort of the innovation efforts going on. And you have willing participants right now in the early stages on what they want, how they want to approach sort of digital therapeutics. Certainly there are efforts from the Office of the National Coordinator for IT to try to review what needs to be out there for people to kind of understand what's happening on digital therapeutics and what's happening on AI and machine learning. Sort of a nutrition label potentially for products coming out on what's in it, how reliable is it, where is this data coming from if you're actually going to be using this to treat patients. So there's a big effort around that, interagency task force being stood up, some new guidance coming out just within the last month or two. So this is really at the cutting edge, and from a stakeholder perspective, this is the time that those regulators want to hear from everybody about what is the best way to kind of move forward on that front. Second big area is around the funding of innovation and research, and we've had a really good run. The last 8 years or so, the NIH budget has really done well. They've had great growth in investment on research side of things. That may be coming to an end right now. So sort of the downside of all of that is that budgetary constraints. We've been through this battle over the debt limit just the last couple of weeks, and the upshot of that is that the investment in things like funding for NIH and funding for CDC and even FDA, we're going to see that growth rate really come down to something closer to 0 to 1% rather than the 5 to 9% we've seen over the last 8 or 10 years. So good news, bad news is we're at a much higher level than we were over the last 20 years because of this investment the last 10 years. But downside is that growth projection on the research dollars is going to be slowing down quite a bit, I think, and that's going to be an issue. And you did mention that there's a host of sort of reimbursement pressures coming, whether it's 340B scrutiny. That's going to be a big focus the next couple of years, and we're already seeing it. Site neutral payments is one, which is a new one, which I think everybody's going to have to get used to because that is going to be a big pressure coming down the pike as potentially Medicare rates are going to equalize from the hospital payments down to something closer to ASC or physician fee schedule rates. So a lot on the docket from that perspective as well.
Well, I'm going to choose to pick on the good news part for the next question. But you mentioned digital therapeutics, and
Yes.
Certainly a space that we see a lot of potential opportunity in. And as Cheryl mentioned, I think a lot of academic medical centers are thinking about translating the innovation happening, in the lab, not just to traditional pharma licensing models like we've historically done, but actually, can we package some of that into a digital therapeutic area? And then I was maybe more excited about it before last week's conversations with this group, and Adam shared the payer perspective here. But Adam, maybe you could share a little bit of how you see payers and employers, because you work with them too, thinking about digital therapeutics and the evolution of that space.
Sure, and I'll start with the positive. I think that there is absolutely excitement around this space, and if you look at the context, it's easy to understand why. If you put yourself in the shoes of a chief human resource officer or a total rewards benefits executive, they've sort of used every arrow in their quiver, so to speak, at this point, to kind of bend the proverbial cost curve, right? We've tinkered around with narrow networks, or the euphemism high performance networks. We've gone all in on high deductible health plans. We've done wellness, lifestyle. We do nutritionist in the benefit structure. Shifted costs to consumers to the max that we can, and just none of it seems to be working. So in those conversations with those folks on the HR and benefit side, there's a real hunger for this, and I think there's hunger for the payers as well for similar reasons. I think the devil in the work here is that, unfortunately, there's a glut of these technologies, and kind of some of the points that Andy was making, it's not quite transparent in the marketplace what works and what doesn't work. What works longitudinally, to the point about equity that Cheryl raised, what works in different populations and different geographies. So you see a pretty high degree of skepticism and a very rigorous demand for proof points to actually get these things covered and reimbursed. You look at the example of Therapeutics, which I know many of us have been following in the news, unfortunate kind of story there, but that really came down to reimbursement. At the end of the day, you could have a great product, you can actually have the data, but if you aren't able to effectively make the case for reimbursement, then you're missing kind of a key leg of the stool there. So innovators in this space have to keep that in mind going forward. And just the fact that also, even if you get past all of those hurdles, there's still the question of uptake. And we see this with my Fortune 500 clients. They all have, to some degree, some sort of a narrow network construct in their benefit design, with outside of a few geographies, California obviously being the most notable there, there's no uptake in those products. Nobody wants to use them. The conversation with the chief human resource officer was just frustrated. Like, what can we do? How can we get these people into these products? And I'm like, well, you can solve, the kind of choice question for Americans and make Americans want less choice, then you probably solve something more fundamental in our society. So, when you look at the landscape ahead, I do think there's promise there, but we really have to be cognizant of these headwinds.
I would just jump in too that this is a big focus for Congress as well. CMS and Medicare have their hands tied somewhat on the coverage of digital therapeutics. So that if you want to get a product, first approved, and then go to CMS and say, hey, how about paying for this? They go, well, even if we wanted to, we can't because we're statutorily limited on what can be approved. But there is good news from the perspective of legislation in Congress potentially to open up the coverage for those types of products, and the Access to Digital Therapeutics Act, which could move this year, maybe not. But once you do get that regulatory approval and the congressional statutory approval for coverage, I think that will really push things forward, because if Medicare covers it, then obviously the rest of the world is probably going to cover it as well. But so that's a little bit of good news there. But I think from before that happens, CMS's hands are tied, and that really does limit the ability to kind of get these products out there.
What are you seeing from your side, Cheryl, on the digital therapeutics?
Some pretty strong initial investments. We've not really jumped way in yet. I say that, but we have. So we launched what we're calling a digital collab in last year, I believe it was. And that actually has a digital health innovation team embedded in it. There's probably 10 fellows that work in that area. And they're there designing ideas, what we can do with those ideas, what it's going to take to fund those ideas. So we're just on that kind of the groundswell, I guess, at this point of determining what might be out there. Part of that collab is also to look for external companies that have stepped into this space. And we've actually invested in one company, the name is Wellcent, and it is responsible for at-home monitoring type services. So the development of a box, actually, that's easy to put in a home so we can keep patients out of the hospital and just do monitoring. So from that perspective, we've had our toe in the water a little bit. We are also working with Amazon Web Services, and we are helping. That's really where the digital health equity component of our initiatives are, and we're actually reaching out with them, partnering with them in terms of how to get digital therapeutics in the hands of those that wouldn't necessarily know they were there. We have a large homeless population, as you might imagine, in Sacramento. So how do we get therapies in the hands of people who may not traditionally have access to broadband, to things of that nature? So that's what that group is working on. So we're putting our toe in the water.
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned before that you recently brought on a chief innovation officer who's helping think about kind of how to commercialize and work with industry more broadly. So maybe building on some of the examples you were just giving, could you share a little bit more about where you're seeing opportunity there, what you're most excited about?
Sure. A couple things. So obviously we do a tremendous amount of research, and the gentleman's literally been on board a month. So
he has everything solved.
He has everything solved. And his job right now is, as most of you might know, I hope you're not physician researchers, and this doesn't come out wrong, but there's always been the theory within that group, at least my limited experience with academic medical centers, that there was a little bit of a taint in taking technology innovations out to the marketplace. I think it's a shame. I think COVID really shined the light on the fact of how important that was, particularly for some basic scientists, to be able to take what they have learned in their products and put them out on the marketplace. So this individual will be responsible for doing just that. So they're going to be responsible for meeting with researchers, understanding what's out there, and so forth. And how do we get it? How do we take the bad taste out of their mouth and put it in the economy, put it to good use? One piece that we're really proud of right now, and it will somehow circle back to this, it happened before the Chief Innovation Officer came on board, is we have a pediatric surgeon who happens to be the chair of surgery, and she and her colleagues have developed a patch that is put in utero for spina bifida. So meant to actually cure the disease within the womb. That will be something that, hopefully taken from the CFO's perspective to market, not only helps those children, but will also be something that, UC Davis can really benefit from. So there's all kinds of those different innovations that we can use this gentleman to find, I guess, because so many of them are hidden within our wonderful research labs, but to find and actually then take to market.
Yeah, that's great. So really, it sounds like, as when you're successful and all that, I'm not going to say if, when you're successful and all of that, it'll be a new revenue stream that kind of offsets some of the other areas of cost. Yes. Adam, Andy, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that kind of that new revenue stream side. Anything else you're seeing is, you're both interacting with lots of different health systems around the country. Anything else interesting you're seeing in approaches that organizations are taking to kind of address that, that gap between commercial health insurers kind of covering the government program side and some of the structural headwinds we're facing?
Yeah, I think channel innovation is an interesting one. The rise of direct to consumer or direct to employer, sort of bypassing the health plans as intermediaries in the distribution of these products. That's one where I've seen a rise in interest recently, and I think it's kind of relatively untested in the marketplace. There are a lot of barriers there. It's a crowded space in some aspects, but I think a lot of promise there. The one thing, maybe if I could put on my negative Nancy hat for just a second here, the challenge with AMCs, I find, look, you have the tripartite mission.
I actually think maybe I've been more positive than you.
I think
What's
so.
wrong with that?
I think so.
Being positive.
I know, it's unusual, but
Sorry, go ahead.
The research mission of AMCs, in a lot of ways, it gives you this sort of natural building ground, this natural platform through tech transfer, through getting this stuff out in the marketplace. There's some risk there that innovation, especially if it's not done in a way that's balanced, that you actually innovate a little bit in the wrong direction, or that you find yourself in competition with players who are just better armed in the space. So it goes back to that point about just having rigor around this and really understanding, if you're going into something like working with an organization that's thinking about potentially launching a next generation EHR, it's like, okay, well, you're getting into Judy's backyard there, so it's a risky proposition. You might want to tread lightly, but I think compared to some of the investments that you would have seen even as recently as 2021 in the era of free money, you are seeing more rigor there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Your point about the, dare I call it, kind of the hubris of academic medical centers sometimes is saying we can do it better. And Cheryl, I was struck by the example you gave of the company that you invested in instead of trying to just build it yourselves. Can you share a little bit more about how you think about that, how you think about when to partner or invest rather than to just go it yourselves?
I think that's an excellent question. I think it's a mix of both. Certainly, we don't necessarily always see the product delivered in that way, right? So WellSent has the product already developed, so why would we take our time to do that? But the capabilities of that company are not the capabilities of our basic researchers. I was with University of Texas when COVID hit, and they have the only BSL level 4, well, I think there's 2 in the country, and the infectious disease work there is something that probably a private company hasn't had time to get into. So I think it's a balance of what your researchers have passion about and what they are doing versus seeking out things that we think that we want to add as a complement to our organization, i.e. digital monitoring. I'm pretty excited to see what else is out there. It's not something I dig into every day, but I'm pretty excited to see what else is out there. So it's a little bit of a shotgun approach today because we don't know everything that's out there. We're finding them. We're saying, does this fit into our model of innovation? Is this things that we think we can take to our patients and can make their lives better? And some won't be that way. Our CIO back in the JP Morgan conference in earlier this year actually had an entire day where he brought all of the IT think tank folks and the AI folks together and really strengthened this collab concept by having, won't mention their names, but some pretty major corporations across the country sit in a room and begin to think about how we might integrate with each other. It's pretty new still, so it'll be, like I said, a little bit of a what comes to us, let us evaluate it. But then on the Chief Innovation Officer side, somebody really digging into what's on the campus today and what we're doing and how can that come forward and help us with some additional revenue recognition. It'll be a little bit of a touch and go, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's great. Excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, me too. Very excited.
So maybe pivoting to a little bit of the less sexy side of innovation. I think when we ask CFOs or CEOs of health systems around the country, the biggest challenge facing them right now, they probably all say workforce, number 1, probably number 2 as well, and maybe number 3. And since we'll probably get kicked out of this conference if we don't talk about generative AI at least a little bit, rather than just kind of more general, and there are all sorts of people in other sessions talking about the science of it, but maybe flipping to the workforce side of it. I know we talked a little bit about this when we were together last week. I'd be interested in thoughts any of you have about, the impact of what's happening in innovation on workforce and workforce challenges more broadly.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one, co-leading a task force within Oliver Wyman where we're starting to explore use cases and looking into the economic and labor market ramifications of all of these technologies. And I kind of draw the parallel to, if you think back a few years ago, to the initial rise in mainstream usage of RPA and IPA, process automation through software, for those of you who aren't familiar. And there was a lot of hype in the media cycle about, this is the end of American jobs. We're going to have software robots that are going to script and take away, 90% of the workforce. And, but obviously that came nowhere close to being how the reality played out. And now you look at generative AI, the large language models, and lo and behold, what is the media cycle around, we're going to strip out all these jobs. And the reality is much more nuanced. I was just a few weeks ago speaking with the CIO of a large academic medical center in New York City. They have, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of 2,500 RPA, IPA bots, exactly 0 FTEs removed as a result of that. What they have been able to do, though, is in a lot of cases, when you think about some of the less sexy parts of work, the stuff that burns people out, that drives burnout in the workforce, discharge paperwork, for example, they've been able to automate a lot of that. And so if you think about these technologies in the context of, this isn't necessarily going to be cost avoidance or cost takeout. In some cases it will, but in many cases, you may just get people to more of a top of licensure. You may make jobs more sustainable, and you may free up resources to then have additional time to focus on more value accretive activities as opposed to some of the mundane paperwork or other things. That's a real promise. And I think you're going to see a lot of that. You will certainly see, like in the lab that Cheryl's talking about, I think you will see some moonshots. I think if you look at medical record summarization, synthesis, insights, what can come out of that, how that could actually derive new care pathways or actually help us, prioritize therapeutic interventions. I think there's going to be a lot of progress there, but don't neglect, I think, as you're on this automation journey, the less sexy parts of this having to do with augmentation of the workforce, because there's really tremendous potential there that we're going to see play out.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I'd follow on with that. That it's kind of interesting from a Washington perspective. There's a kind of a new push for redirecting more of the workforce towards actual caregivers too. So we've seen on the nursing home side, there's an expectation of a regulation that's going to be coming out that's going to increase mandatory staffing levels in nursing homes. The nursing homes obviously are arguing that we don't have enough staffing right now. Part of the play is, well, you do this over a longer period of time and you'll have some innovations to try to, shift kind of the services that are being provided that will help the nursing homes. And part of the real focus is around the quality of the care, more touch for the service providers with the patients. And that's really where the focus is from Washington's perspective of trying to boost that. We also saw it on the Medicaid side for home and community-based care service providers as well, where they're mandating a certain percentage of the dollars going to these Medicaid providers has to be provided to the actual home care workforce. So, trying to squeeze the overhead, squeeze the administrative burdens and administrative costs, that's a real threat to some organizations, but it's an interesting dynamic to try to basically impose kind of medical loss ratio style approaches for these types of companies that provide services in home care and in nursing homes, and saying, hey, we're going to limit sort of the administrative costs and the profitability here. You've got to deliver more of the dollars to your workforce. Interesting approach. I think these things are going to play out over a longer period of time. A lot of pushback, as you can imagine, from organizations saying, don't tell us how much of our dollars have to go to the workforce. But that's an interesting kind of innovation coming from DC and Washington and regulators. We've seen it a little bit at the state level as well. Illinois has already implemented something like that. So interesting dynamic on how the regulations kind of impacting sort of the workforce. Some of this also driven by unions who are interested in trying to get more of the dollars dedicated to the actual workforce providers.
That's interesting, and potential unintended consequences there of
Yes.
ceasing innovation in places where where that workforce is mandated at a certain level.
Absolutely.
Because the clinical workforce is especially nursing, the largest component of labor. And if you think 5-10 years out, could be a lot of opportunity for allowing individuals to be more productive and therefore think about staffing in a different way,
Right.
Leveraging technology.
Yep, that's right.
What are you guys seeing at UC Davis, Cheryl?
So we are as everyone knows, a fairly unionized state, and I'm a year in again. So I think my first 2 months there was our first negotiation. I don't know where that will go from that perspective. I do know that from just general technology, there certainly are a lot of opportunities to use AI. As it changes and as it possibly allows a nurse to act at a different level, to your point, at a top of their license, I don't know that it's necessarily going to take a lot of labor cost out. It may take some of the lower level functions, if you will, some things that maybe are done by HUCs or things of that nature. It may allow that work to be done a little bit more expeditiously. But I don't know that we see right now that happening in terms of the RNs and the LPNs and taking that out. If that were to happen, hopefully we would look at staffing ratios and have some conversations that we could have and maybe deploy those workforce individuals to a different area. We are still struggling with deploying APPs at the top of their license. I'm sure many of you are as well. But I do believe there's a lot of opportunity. I don't think we can ignore that it may change the workforce, but I don't think it's really going to drastically reduce what we see. I know it won't in California for some time, probably in my lifetime, but it won't really change that a great deal.
So it sounds like both of you are saying, kind of the same direction here. So if I were to say, okay, your, let's say population is stable in your geography, the need for care is stable, let's say, which, ignore the aging
Right.
population for a minute, and your market share stays the same, you don't think that you'd be able to deliver the same amount of care with fewer people necessarily in 3 years, 5 years?
Do I think we could?
Do you think you will? Yeah. How about that?
No,
Okay.
not in 3 to 5 years. I
Adam,
don't see
it sounds like
that.
you're thinking the same thing.
Yeah, same amount, but then again, is it better care though? Is
Okay.
it care that's done more sustainably? Is it care that is better able to serve, the needs of equity because of these new technologies?
Right.
There, I do think there is tremendous potential.
Yeah, you're dodging the question. I see. Okay, then that's good. That's good.
I'm a consultant, Niyum.
It's okay.
Yeah,
It's
do that well.
we'll have the same number of people. We'll just be able to deliver better care. Not to put yes to put everybody on the spot. I'd love just a quick show of hands. So in a market using those same assumptions, stable population, stable demographics, same number of people to deliver the same care, fewer number of people to deliver the same care, or more. So show of hands, same number of people to deliver the same care. Okay. Fewer number of people to deliver the same care. Okay. More number of people to deliver the same care. Oh, all right. I didn't see hands there from some of our clinical leaders.
And
Yeah, exactly. I was watching you the whole time, Jeanette and Heather.
It's a different workforce. It's not more people, less people.
Okay, so you would say, okay, I should have offered that then. So kind of roughly the same number, but a different type of workforce seems to be okay. I think it's an interesting, kind of macroeconomic question to some extent, right? With healthcare is 20% of GDP, with the hospital system in every city, town, and county in America being the largest employer, largest private employer. What are the impacts of this? And so maybe people are optimistic around better care and different people able to deliver the same care, but not necessarily thinking we're going to shrink healthcare as a percent of GDP so that we can invest in other sectors.
Well, this is ironic for the digital health guy to be saying this, but all of the investment that we've had up to this point in innovative therapeutic modalities and digital technology, has any of that really taken out costs? So
No, actually,
Probably
there's
added
there's
to it.
been
Yes.
material productivity. Healthcare is one of the few industries that has seen not just flat but negative productivity increases over the
Yes.
past
Yeah,
decade.
exactly. Yeah. So I just don't see anything. We're going to be having this conversation 10 years from now on whatever the next greatest thing is, and I guarantee you that when we look back at GPT-4, the trajectory is not going to change. A little skeptical there.
No, I agree. I mean, more immediate, what we're facing from a regulatory perspective too, on the reimbursement side of telehealth. It's a great example. Everybody thought, oh, this telehealth is going to be great because it's going to, people won't have to go to the hospital, go to their physician. And what usually happens is you kind of double up. You get the initial telehealth consult, which does cost some money, obviously. And then the doctor says, yeah, I really need to see you in the office. So the patient then has to come into the office anyway. So now you've sort of doubled up. So while yes, there's some things that get weeded out on the telehealth consult and say, yeah, I don't need to see you, there's a lot that you're sort of doubling up on. You have both the telehealth and the actual in-person visit. And now, have you taken any costs out of the system? Probably not. And the Congressional Budget Office is grappling with that right now because they're figuring out, well, will all this growth of telehealth, and some of it has dropped off a good bit, but on the substance abuse and mental health side, we've seen tremendous growth. But the question is, that's an area where you don't actually need to kind of feel and touch the person to have an impact. But for all of the other stuff where we saw the big spike up during the pandemic, maybe that's not really as cost-saving as everybody thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I think it's a great space that'll be interesting to track where it goes as the technology stabilizes, right? We had this artificial surge in demand, basically driven by the pandemic. And I think about, certainly in areas like primary care or urgent care, we're seeing some of that. Okay, is it really taking out cost? But then, as you mentioned, substance use disorder, mental health, yes, it's substitutive, which is great and provides greater access. Or, the one that surprised me, I was talking to one of our surgical division chiefs who said that they do 95% of their visits via telehealth because it's not a hands-on patient sort of evaluation on the pre-op side. They're looking at scans, looking at lab results, and they don't need the patient to come in. And actually, that's great. That's a great productivity enhancer. And so we'll see. Be interesting to see how that manifests. And then the same thing on the innovation cycle with with AI and other sorts of technologies.
Yeah, and telehealth, I mean, that is a great example of kind of this back and forth that we're having because, number one, even though it has sort of reverted back to the mean after the COVID-19 pandemic, there's still tremendous room to expand the usage of telehealth in certain specialties. And I think we'll see that headroom be filled in over the coming years. And also back to this, not necessarily more or less, but better. I think about what telehealth has enabled in certain communities. I grew up, Cheryl and I were having this conversation in a one traffic light town, kind of middle of nowhere in northern Florida, where people in some cases had to drive 45 minutes to get to a primary care office or a hospital. And now you can actually, get on Teladoc or one of these applications and they could send you a blood pressure monitor, they could send you a continuous glucose monitor, and you can actually manage your health remotely from the middle of nowhere. So there are tremendous opportunities there. But again, the cost takeout aspect is where I think there's due skepticism.
Yeah.
We also went to opposing football dynasties, but that's okay.
No comment.
I do think there's, I think, and I'm certainly not a physician, I think where a lot of the AI has so much opportunity is just in the delivery of care. And as an academic medical center, our access, and I believe this is probably the case with most, could use a good washing, if I can say it like that. But we can use a lot of that AI technology to make sure we're seeing the patients we need to see and not seeing a stream of patients or backlogging patient access to us. And we have, pardon the example, we have our CIO is actually a gastroenterologist, so his example is I don't need to see everybody, I don't need to give everybody a colonoscopy, I can use AI to differentiate their disease states and maybe send Cologuard to some people's houses. That access is then opened up for people that might have more risk factors for colon cancer. So I think those types of things are really what we're looking at and how we use those going forward. There's a cost benefit to that. Certainly development of the AI is a cost, but actually, from a revenue perspective, it brings in those more acute patients, and that does help. So maybe there is some benefit, to the top line.
Well, and I think it's I'm just thinking about, our sponsor here at Bank of America. If you use a banking analogy, and Adam, you and I were talking about this, what happened with telehealth would be the equivalent as if we talk to tellers via video right now.
Sure.
Right, and that's not what online banking is, right? there's actually in the financial services industry, a great use of technology to change the way that we interact. And maybe that's what we can see with this generation of what we do from a technology standpoint, is actually use it to deliver care differently, but bring the right patients in for different types of care, or rather than just virtualizing a physical interaction.
Exactly, most definitely. I think there's a lot of promise there. I don't think that the saying now is it doesn't replace the physician, it just lets them do more of what they were intended to do. Maybe they operate at the higher part of their license as well.
Well, we have a little bit of time for questions from the group if there's, and I think we've been asked to make sure that people use the microphone because we are recording, but happy to take questions from any of you. No? Shy group? Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Ines. I work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. We do see quite a similar shift towards more care being held at home, mostly for cost-saving purposes in Denmark. How much do you envision this to replace the inpatient segment within the coming years within your two health systems? Do you expect 50% of it to be replaced, or only 10 to 15%? I don't know.
You want to start?
We have another care at home initiative, another initiative that we are just kicking off as well. And we've actually entered into a partnership for some delivery of meds to home. So we'll see how that goes. It's still pretty new. I think that's a tremendous opportunity to decant some of the inpatient type work that we're doing. Even though we are a very subspecialty academic medical center, we still have folks that come into the ED and are admitted that really probably don't need to be admitted, or could be sent home with some appropriate care. So we are just kicking that off, but it's a huge part of our initiative as well. It's the WellSent technology would be a great partner with discharging people from the ED into home, and then we can monitor them from that perspective. I think it's a big piece. I think it has an opportunity to really grow.
Yeah, I agree. It's a big opportunity. I'm looking at Heather here, who's the president of Mass General Brigham Healthcare at Home, which is our home-based care operating unit. And I think there's a number of pieces to it. So starting with the inpatient side, we have an average daily census of about 30 patients who are inpatient eligible. They should be, normally they would be upstairs in an inpatient bed receiving that care. They are being cared for in the home, and we're just hitting our inflection point by, I'd say within another 6 to 9 months, that number will be 2 or 3x that size. And so that's getting material into the mid-single digits of the percent of inpatient patients already with current technology, right? Just with the process that's kind of process innovation. If you look at some other countries, Israel, Australia, they're both running in the 5 to 10% of their inpatient stays being done, hospital at home as technology advances. I think the ceiling on that is higher. But I think there's also opportunity if we think about once a patient is in the home setting, thinking about the financial side of it. Right now, a lot of the differentiation between facility-based care settings is based on reimbursement dynamics. Mm-hmm. So an inpatient hospital in the US is paid differently than a long-term acute care facility, than a skilled nursing facility, than home health. And actually, some of those things are paid by episode, some are paid by day. So it's a mess. And if you were to just get the patient home with whichever level of care they need, it also allows you to seamlessly build across that. And so while I think there will be material impact to patients who present in the hospital then being sent home, yes, but also patients who we avoid getting into the hospital by monitoring them more effectively in the first place and delivering home-based chronic disease management more effectively, patients who are discharged more quickly from the hospital because you can get them to their bed at home even if you can't find a skilled nursing facility bed. So I think the more that we kind of re-architect the system from the ground up using the home, it'll be a more and more material part of how we deliver care in the future. Matt, you had your hand up too. I'm going to call you out.
Thank you, and this is a great panel, so thank you very much for sharing everything. My question actually hinges off the last comment made, which was, this is an industry in the U.S. largely that functions off of the end state. Our reimbursement drives behavior, and we have a big wave of costs coming in from cell and gene therapies. What do you see the role in academic medical centers and centers of excellence to shape what the value is or the cost of those therapies? You know, it's being value priced today. What do you see your role in helping shape the care and where the care is given, the site of service, and ultimately how you can shape the reimbursement around that between payers and academic medical centers?
That's a loaded question, Matt.
Thank you.
You know, I think that so reimbursement drives behavior to the extent that faculty are compensated based on the reimbursement. We're under a work model, an RVU model, and I do believe that there still is a tremendous amount of thought and feel in our academic medical center that they just don't want to know about that, right? So we are heavily Medicaid due to a lot of supplemental payments. We are paid well for that, almost up to the Medicare limit, which is very unusual. So for us, I don't think that really drives their behavior until it becomes something directly related to their compensation. And this group of faculty really are very focused on those that do not have appropriate access to care. So I don't know that I can answer the other part of that. I think that I think they still are very interested in innovation, though, and where that will take us in care. So I think there's a big motivation for that. I'm not sure I can answer that at the moment.
Adam or Andy, anything in that cell and gene therapy space, which I think would be interesting given the dollars involved. Anything you're seeing on either the payer side or the regulatory side that, on how we as an industry ought to be tackling this?
Yeah, on the regulatory side, it's interesting. I mean, there's certainly a lot of focus on trying to figure out how to better control those costs, because you were talking about such a large dollars for these therapies. What we have seen is that, most recently, the first kind of foray or toe into the water is on the Medicaid side, where the federal government wants to be able to kind of harness all 50 states on the Medicaid side to help negotiate on behalf of all 50 states, which intuitively makes a lot of sense if you're going to go up against the drug companies who want to charge $1 million for a therapy. Say, well, we would want to round up all 50 states to have that negotiating clout. Obviously, there's a lot of pushback for that on the other side from the drug manufacturer's side. But that's sort of the first kind of toe in the water. There's a lot of talk and a lot of discussion about what are the best ways to kind of tackle that, because you don't want to kind of stifle the innovation, but anything that the government does to kind of push back on the reimbursement model is viewed as stifling the innovation. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of caught a little bit in between both. So we're really at the early stages of that right now, and as you said, these next however many years, as more and more of those kind of therapies come online with huge dollars attached to them, is a real big problem from Washington's perspective, because on the one hand, they know they have to kind of manage the cost. There's not an unlimited number of dollars out there. And on the other hand, there's this criticism of you're going to stifle innovation if you do anything to try to control those costs. So I don't know, Adam, if you got...
That's a really good point, too. And where is the innovation stifled? Is it stifled from the organizational perspective or the physician perspective? I would separate those two, because the investment the organization's willing to make with that limited reimbursement is probably a whole lot different than the faculty's desire to have that innovation present.
Yeah, and I think that what we've seen in cell therapy, obviously, which is currently, especially on the CAR T side, much larger as a percentage than anything else, right, is yes, there's the drug cost piece of it, but since most of it is delivered inpatient, that drug cost is actually borne by the delivery systems. Yes. And so, exactly, we lose money on every patient. We're paying the drug company what we're paying them, but right. On the commercially reimbursed patients, maybe we're breaking even. On the Medicare and Medicaid side, we're losing money on every patient. And when you're talking $1 million a patient, yeah, this adds up, right?
Absolutely.
And that's the fully allocate, right? Yeah. That's the cost of the bed that they take up for for so long as well. And so it's certainly something we'll need to sort through as an industry.
Yeah, and on the payment side and reimbursement
Yeah,
coverage,
I'm just going to mention that.
yeah, access is so critical. And I mean, the fact that we now have the ability in some cases to cure something like sickle cell anemia, it's potentially groundbreaking. What we're seeing, and to the best of my knowledge, I think these are pretty nascent in the market at this point, but novel partnerships between payers and pharmaceutical companies, whereby you will actually see sort of a almost subscription model to cover these. And then when that does pop up in the population, it's not a case of like, okay, now there's a $1 million check being written. It's being sort of subsidized across the population and you're paying a subscription. So to the best of my knowledge, I think those sorts of novel mechanisms around the financing are still getting up to speed in the market. But we're going to have to see a lot more of that. We're going to have to see things and changes on the regulatory side to really mainstream access to these therapeutics.
Yeah, the other angle from Washington's perspective, there's another idea on the table with regards to the accelerated pathway approval for these new drugs and everything. Basically saying, they get an accelerated approval for these drugs. Hey, that's great to get them on the market sooner, but that kind of leaves open the question of, well, we don't have all of the post-market studies done. How really effective is this product in comparison to what's already out there available from a therapy perspective? So the Biden administration is now thrown on the table, which is also very, very controversial. It's like, well, maybe Medicare is not going to pay as much for drugs approved through the accelerated pathway. And until you get those follow-up studies done and you get sort of, down the path of actually having these confirmatory studies, we're not going to pay you as much. So it's a kind of a bifurcated reimbursement model on those kinds of therapies, which is kind of interesting, but very controversial.
Yeah. I think we'll also probably see some heterogeneity in how it's approached depending on what the therapy is addressing, right? And I think about, to the point of if you're curing something that would have had a lot of downstream costs in the future, there are other ways to think about that. And actually one of the things that I'm glad it never needed to be used because of kind of how the story ended, but when, originally with the Hep C drugs, when Sovaldi and Harvoni came out, there were a couple of Medicaid directors from large states that were working together to actually say, if we paid for it for every single Medicaid beneficiary who was Hep C positive now, right? And basically a lot of states needed to dole it out over a few years because they just couldn't afford it. And they're saying if we did it all now and we actually bundled that risk and securitized it, you could get a nice, 7% coupon on that, right? Yeah. And somebody in the financial services sector would be fine selling that. And then, the next set of drugs came out and the price quickly dropped from 80,000 to 20,000 and, no issue. But it is interesting because there are some things where, there are some conditions that are being addressed here where you're stopping millions of dollars of future cost potentially by addressing it now. And ideally, there should be some way to transfer that so that society can benefit, but yet to be figured out.
Yeah, going again back to our home state and thinking about parallels to the property and casualty market, like this is what happens with catastrophe bonds,
That's
right?
Yeah.
And it's a way of pricing around that sort of risk. So absolutely.
We have time for maybe one more. All right.
Hi, Hassan Al-Banna from Global Patient Service, Mass General Brigham. In your opinion, where do you think the international market, as a way to offset the cost and subsidize some of the care and open access to other cases as well, which is Medicare, Medicaid, that we lose money on, have a role in the future? And maybe at UC Davis, do you have vision about this, and to the rest of the panel as well?
I would say that the faculty see the international marketplace as a tremendous asset for them, particularly reducing some barriers to innovation. I'm not sure that, I'm not sure California sees it quite that way yet from their perspective, but I think our faculty travel partner have a tremendous amount of workings with folks that are not within the United States, so a ton of opportunity there. From the funding perspective, that might even get a little bit more dicier. I don't know what you're seeing at the Brigham, but I think that could certainly be helpful. I don't know how you get that back across the United States from a governmental perspective as well. That would be very interesting to hear, but certainly a ton of opportunity there. Yes.
Any thoughts from your
On
perspective?
the, on the regulatory side, it's very difficult. I mean, depending on where the relationships are. I mean, certainly from the China-U.S.
Yeah.
perspective, that
Tough.
gets very difficult right now. And both the Biden administration and Republicans in Congress have a very big concern about sort of technology transfer between U.S. and China right now. And that's a real problem, including in the biotech space. And that's a real big focus, along with semiconductors and more of a traditional technologies, tech transfer as well. So that's a big concern. If you're talking about outside of China, yeah, I think there's real opportunities there. But
Or even, I think you might have been asking also the opportunity of patients who choose to come to the U.S. for care from abroad and are reimbursed at a higher margin
Sure.
than,
Right, well, that's-
I don't know if you guys are seeing much of that in your market.
We certainly saw it when I was in DC. We saw a tremendous amount of that, folks coming in from, and there are dollars there, definitely. Don't see it quite as much at UC Davis. See it a good bit more maybe in the San Francisco market, just because of the the attraction of the San Francisco area, and primarily in the transplant space, we see a great deal of that. But I think there's a big opportunity, absolutely huge opportunity from that perspective.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no real regulatory issues with that.
No,
so, yeah.
no.
Great.
I'm not sure the PGA did us a whole lot of good in terms of.
Well, thank you again, Cheryl, Adam, Andy.